I was only 13 years old and I was living the life of my dreams. I had the house to myself on the weekends. My family was far away, and it was like having my own little kingdom. The living room was my throne room. The kitchen was my banquet hall, stocked with as many snacks and sodas as I wanted. A video game marathon was ready, and my trusty gaming console was waiting for action. The whole house was quiet and peaceful, just me and my thoughts. I was lying on my favorite couch, ready to dive into a world of adventure and mystery. I felt free, like a glimpse into solitude, independence, adulthood. It was the perfect setting for a weekend of carefree gaming and devouring my favorite pizza with pepperoni and extra cheese. However, something strange happened. I was engrossed in the game and in the middle of an epic battle when I started to hear strange rustling sounds outside. At first, it was a faint sound, like a whisper coming from the window. I stopped my game and listened to the sound. It was probably midnight. My first thought was that it was probably a stray cat or raccoon rummaging through the garbage can. But this sound was different. I turned down the volume on my game, and the sudden silence made the sound more distinct. It was probably near the bushes or the front porch. My heart began to beat a little faster with a mixture of curiosity and fear. There was no reason for someone to be outside, especially at this hour. I tried to dismiss it as probably the wind or an animal. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, and it was probably just paranoia. Besides, it was an opportunity to prove that I could stay home alone. I was no longer a child, not a child afraid of the dark or imaginary monsters. No, I was 13, almost an adult, and adults don't panic at the slightest noise. Anyway, I kept playing, diving back into the game and trying to immerse myself in the digital world. However, I kept hearing the same noise even within the game sounds. It was persistent and started to really freak me out. The buzzing seemed to weave in between the explosions and dialogue of the game, constantly reminding me that something was wrong. It was like an insistent thought that couldn't be ignored, and it got louder and more insistent with each passing hour. So I paused the game. The screen froze in the middle of the action, and there was silence in the room, if you didn't count the eerie sound outside. Feeling my heart racing with excitement, I slowly walked over to the window. The curtains, normally a barrier between me and the outside world, suddenly seemed very thin and flimsy. I carefully pulled the curtains aside and looked out. The silhouette of a man I did not know stood in the garden, dimly lit by a street lamp. It was an eerie sight. I sneaked downstairs and looked out the front window, but it was too dark to make out anything. I was alone, torn between feeling like I was overreacting and feeling like I had to do something. I opened the door a little and looked around, but there was nothing. Everything was quiet again. I went outside and took a quick look around. There was no one in the garden. I told myself I was fine, trying to calm my racing heart. I decided to play a few more games to distract myself and went back into the house. That's when my world was turned upside down. Instead of the usual creaks and groans of the house, I heard a more ominous sound coming from my parents' room. I approached the door, screaming with every fiber of my being that something was terribly wrong. The door creaked open, and there they were. A figure stood in the darkness. I choked. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My head was in panic. Then a man moved, his steps slow and forward. His face was visible in the eerie glow of the moonlight. A disturbing smile. A grotesque smile that sent a shiver down my spine. My heart was beating so loudly that I was afraid he could hear me. That's when my survival instincts kicked in. Driven by primal fear, I turned and started running. I ran like the wind down the stairs, my feet barely touching the ground. Behind me, I heard thunderous footsteps, the nightmare chasing me. I burst through the front door and into the cold night air. It hit me like a wave, but in the rush of the moment, I didn't even feel the cold. My feet carried me forward, the dim light of the street lamps blurring my peripheral vision. My heart accelerated, beating inside my mouth like a heartbeat that wouldn't stop. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Panic gripped me as I ran. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being chased. The footsteps echoing in my ears and the menacing rhythm of the chase added to my fear. I didn't dare look back, not knowing what I might see. Minutes seemed like hours as I kept running. But then, thankfully, the footsteps gave way to silence. I was out of breath, my heart still pounding. With trembling hands, I desperately clutched the cell phone. Finally, I dialed 911 and, my voice shaking, I explained what had happened. It seemed like an eternity before the police arrived. We returned home, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It was already a crime scene. The police found the intruder hiding in my parents' room like it was their property. Seeing them handcuffed and taken away by the police was surreal, like a scene from a movie. But it was real. When my parents returned the next day, the house looked different and a little dirty. We cleaned it, but it was more than physical dirt. It was memory and fear. The slightest sound made me jump. I was always looking over my shoulder and expecting the worst. It took a long time to feel normal again. The nights were the hardest. Every shadow reminded me of that fear. But eventually I got through it one day at a time and was able to trust the silence again and feel safe in my own bed. This experience, as scary as it was, became a part of me. It is a story of survival, of facing one's deepest fears. It taught me to be vigilant and brave, even when my instincts told me to run. It reminds me of the nights when I faced danger, and the place where I always felt safest, my home. A few years ago, I was living with my ex-boyfriend. We had just moved into a new 2-bedroom house, and I was busy preparing for the move. We decided to turn one of the bedrooms into an office, so we wouldn't have to go through the bedroom to get to the bathroom. We often had friends over for sleepovers on the couch, and we didn't feel comfortable with them going through our private bedroom. About a month after we moved in, my ex-girlfriend moved out with a coworker and left me home alone. In the evening, while watching TV and eating dinner, I heard some strange noises. It was getting late, so I decided to go upstairs to work on the computer before going to bed. Our phone was prepaid and there was no more money in it for me to call. When I was alone, I chose the back room as my sleeping place, where a small table lamp gave a weak light. However, when I started typing on my laptop, I heard strange noises again. At first, it was a barely audible creaking and rustling sound, and I struggled to confirm that it was not a figment of my imagination. I turned off the music and headed for the bedroom door, but no one was there. It was only when I returned to the back room that I realized I couldn't see anything out of the window from there. Our garden was small, surrounded by a high brick wall and dark around the wooden gate. To me, even the backyard was empty. When I returned to work, I turned the music back on, and after about 10 minutes I heard a creaking sound similar to the sound of steel surfaces colliding. The sound was still quiet, as if it was trying to avoid being recognized at its source. I finally panicked and left the bedroom to get a heavy iron bar from the back of the closet. Since I didn't know what was going on, I decided not to turn on the lights. I didn't want the intruder to know where I was. Remember, I had no way of contacting anyone, and I was starting to worry that there was an intruder in the house. I went back to the study in the back room, quietly closed and locked the door, put a chair under the handle, and for 20 minutes, nothing happened. I began to feel stupid in my excitement. Maybe it was because it was the first time I was alone in this house, I thought. But this time, I decided not to put on music, because after a few minutes I heard 2 men whispering. Luckily, the voices were different from those in the house. The window in the study was slightly ajar, and I thought the source of the sound was there. I headed to the bathroom to get a better view of the backyard. The study and bathroom were on the L-shaped fence enclosing the garden, with the bathroom facing the street. I climbed up onto the ledge and slowly opened the window to peer into the alley. Nothing could be seen, but the whispering grew louder and came right through the door. I couldn't catch the entire conversation, but the general gist was audible. They knew and realized that we had valuable things in the house. Guitars, computers, my SLR camera, TV, game console, etc. I thought they realized I was home alone. They wanted to wait until I was asleep and try to get into the house. I kept holding on to the shelves that seemed safe until I heard a loud noise. It sounded like they had stopped hiding and were about to break down the door. I could see them trembling from the violent charge, and I could only imagine the magnitude of it. I was a young girl then, short, about 160 centimeters tall, and weighing about 58 kilos, so it was scary to look at the door as I struggled to steady myself. I gripped the iron bar tightly and looked for a place to hide from them. Suddenly, a bright light shone behind me. At first, I was scared and hid behind the house, thinking they were using flashlights, but then I heard dogs barking and people shouting. When I looked again, the light was illuminating the garden of the house across the street. When I locked the bathroom door, I heard a noise, and just a few seconds later, 2 fast footsteps disappeared into the alley. I locked the door and waited for my friends, who always came home drunk, to return. The lack of sleep that night was unbearable for me. The next morning I went out into the garden and saw that my gate was just hanging on the hinges, and anyone who wanted to could easily enter from the street. I looked at the keyhole behind the door and saw that it was scratched, as if someone had tried to break the lock. Without the warnings of my neighbors, much of what happened behind me could have happened. These events took place in the summer of 1998, when my home was in Boston.